I'd like to welcome everyone to the semi-finals for Otago Australs 2014. Before the debate begins, I'd like to congratulate both teams to make it this far. On the affirmative, we have Victoria Wellington 1. And on the negative team, we have University of Sydney Union 1. Also joining me on the adjudication panel from Monash University, we have Madeline Schultz. From Otago University, we have John Catarina. From IIUM, we have Sadiq. From NUS, Andre. And from the University of Oxford, Annie. Without further ado, I'd like to call on the first speaker from Dick Wellington, Asher, to speak to the motion of the bear.
In the United States, Mr. Speaker, police discriminate against African Americans from a one end, stop Terry searches, through selective application of drug laws, through at the other end to, quite simply, the murder of African Americans. In the United States, the school system is effectively apartheid in inner city areas in terms of its resource allocation. In the United States, the substantially lower economic mobility. In the United States, the voting system discriminates against black people, the large volume of whom are disenfranchised on a whole number of grounds. In the United States, the criminal justice system discriminates against black people, who are approximately 10% of the population, but 50% of the prison population. In 2008, a black legislative deadlock from 2010, a fantastic opportunity has been missed. On this side of the House, we regret that. 3 substantive points from the affirming team. Firstly, I want to talk about why it was particularly important for Barack Obama. Secondly, I want to talk about what that kind of presidency would have looked like if he had made more of a point of his own experiences and how that applies to people who also suffer from discrimination by dint of a characteristic of themselves that they cannot change. Thirdly, I want to talk about how his silence is the greatest crime, for it has abetted racist narratives, both those which are explicit and more bland, beige, end-of-history ideas that race is no longer a problem in America. First point then, why was this important for him? Why did it matter? Well, the first thing is prosaic. He's experienced this kind of discrimination himself in his own life, which puts him in a particularly good position to articulate what it is to feel discriminated against. It's very difficult for white liberals who have never experienced this kind of thing to know, to understand, and to express the feeling of suffering from that kind of oppression. You cannot see the little things which affect people in terms of discrimination when you live inside your own little bubble. This is an opportunity that was only available to a black president, and moreover, he's probably going to be the last black president for quite some time, right? A large window of opportunity there has been missed. But more importantly, he sold this dream to the country. He told people that he was the agent of hope and change. He made a great deal during his campaign in 2008, rising from senator to the White House, of the fact that he came from a different racial background to his other candidates. He made those promises and he failed to fulfill them. That's why it was particularly important for him. What would things have been like had he taken a different path? The first thing to say here is that the presidency is an incredibly powerful office, right? It has an opportunity to start conversations that no other office in the country, no other person is able to do. There is quite literally nothing that he could do to prevent people from reporting what it is that he says, right? Which means that he can say absolutely whatever he wants, particularly now that he's into his second term. He has an opportunity to get conversations going, to lay bare the reality of the discrimination and oppression that is an entrenched part of that American system. And that's an opportunity to raise people's consciousnesses about the small ways in which a various degree of legislative changes, right through from the federal level down to state and local governments, and the way in which, for instance, resources are allocated to schools, the way in which districts are decided in terms of voting and so on, can affect the livelihoods and well-being of people who are from racial minorities who suffer discrimination. Moreover, other than just raising that kind of consciousness and having people aware of some of those issues which are going on, he missed an opportunity to enliven an activist liberal base. Now, these movements exist, right? We've seen Occupy Wall Street, we've seen fragmented various bubbles of opposition from a liberal activist base around the United States. But what that organization is lacking is any form of figurehead. They were promised a president who would lead that kind of movement, and he's failed to deliver on those promises. You have a capacity in terms of grassroots movements to reshape narratives of values of what it is to be an American, what is the American story. Let's look for a moment at the effectiveness of the Tea Party in reshaping the idea of values of America, right? The idea of the free individual has been captured by the Tea Party and reframed as a narrative of unrelenting free market capitalism. That's not the way the American story has always been seen, right? But that was an imprint that was impressed upon that by an activist base who was well mobilized. Obama failed to provide a rallying point in terms of narratives about race and oppression, which could have enlivened those people to rally around that kind of point and provide for a counterweight to the strength of the Tea Party on the right. And we do prefer liberal activism on the left to activism on the right, because it seems quite simply that the left in America is substantially more anti-racist than the right in America. Think how greatly the Tea Party has thrived over race baiting and suggestions that Barack Obama does not deserve his office on grounds of his color. And while quite often that's not necessarily the leaders of those movements, that's a narrative which exists throughout the Tea Party on occasions when you see Clyde Bundy and so on rear his head before he was thrown under the bus. These are prevalent ideas. There has been no bulwark to that provided by Obama on the right. What could that liberal activist base have done? That's something which would continue beyond this presidency, right? Because that's about to come to an end. And regardless of whether or not he's replaced by another Democrat, another liberal, it doesn't matter, because there's an opportunity to mobilize people around the notion of race which has been missed. Hillary Clinton, if she is elected, fingers crossed, is not going to be able to express these ideas in the same way that he had an opportunity to. She lacks the credibility, she lacks the experience, and per my first point, she lacks the idea to even understand quite what it is like to tell these kind of stories. Let's talk then about the third point, and that's why silence is the greatest shame of them all. What's been the framing of his presidency when he's refused to talk about race? Because when he was first elected, people wanted to talk about how this was a big change moment in the United States, and that's absolutely true. Acknowledging that it was a change moment, there are two ways in which that change could have been framed. The way in which it was and has turned out to have been framed was that race is no longer an issue because there is now a person of African-American origin in the White House, right? The alternative way in which that narrative could have been framed is that Barack Obama is an outlier, and that is the truth of the matter, right? It's not the case for a great many African Americans that that opportunity would ever be a possibility for them. And the idea that his presence there is the suggestion of some kind of end of history for racism in America has allowed that narrative to be perpetuated. He's left himself this kind of like beige colorless individual who's only seen as black by those who want to criticize him for being black. But those who want to see him as black as some kind of light on the hill are unable to see him as black because he has unbraced himself by refusing to talk about this in any open way. So the effect of all of this is to provide for an opportunity to strengthen racist narratives that criticize him as incompetent and suggestions that is on grounds of this color, but it's left no opportunity for those on the left, those who want to participate in narratives of emancipatory politics, to identify him as any kind of African-American leader. It's a tacit reinforcement of that idea that there's no longer any need for change there. And moreover, and more simply, there's not just as a framing issue of where his presidency has failed to go, but it's also failed to counter the open racist narratives that happen against him. Congressmen who make history by shouting at him during the State of Union address in the moment where all of Congress will be united behind the president. People who show him open disrespect on grounds of his color have been left to go unchecked, unrebuffed, as though that is an acceptable means of conduct and a reading of race that's permissible in the United States of America. He had a chance to render visible that system of oppression which has existed since slavery. He failed to do that.
I think Asher for his speech and call on Ed to open the presidency.
Mr. Speaker, in 2008, Barack Obama told us there is wrong. There is. We agree with that in this debate. What we disagree with is that the role of the American president is to be an activist or a storyteller for one particular group of people and represent the narrative of his success and leadership through that lens, but rather to create a unifying narrative of leadership and American nationalism that enables that country to overcome the significant and multifaceted challenges that they face as a country in 2014. What I want to do in this speech is firstly, is two things. I'm going to firstly explain why this type of significant racial narrative would have undermined practical policy of the United States and the achievements of Barack Obama as president during his terms. And I'm secondly going to tell you why it was bad for racial politics and racial discourse in that country and the experiences of people who do feel discrimination and do feel disadvantage. Before I do that, let's look at some rebuttal. Asher told us that this was an incredibly important opportunity. There are a couple of grounds on which he wanted to do that. He firstly told us that Barack Obama himself had experienced discrimination, could speak to it in ways that other people couldn't. The only response that we have to that, Madam Speaker, is that he hasn't. Barack Obama has not experienced discrimination the way that most African Americans have. He was born to a good family, went to a good school, he was editor of Harvard Law Review, and with a Kenyan father and a white mother, the narrative of his oppression is very distinct from the narrative of oppression that many people have, which is connected to the legacy of slavery, the structural disadvantage and oppression that comes from that narrative. We think that Barack Obama is a black man with black skin. He's going to base the racial narrative that he's able to engage with on the appearance of that skin. He's not able to connect in the same way that this team wanted to with the experience of having that skin, what that skin means for other people in that country. They secondly told us that Barack Obama sold the dream and failed to live up to it. We think the narrative and the language and the rhetoric of Barack Obama's campaign was one that said that I am a black man and I embrace that fact, but this presidency and this campaign is not about that. That we should celebrate the success of that victory as presidency because he is black and is president, but not that he became president because he was black. We think it's an incredibly important distinction in this debate. We thirdly said, the third point that they said here is that this is a missed opportunity. That because he's in his final term, Barack Obama can say what he wants. That's incredibly simplistic political, an incredibly simplistic political evaluation of this debate. Like, just because he doesn't have to run for a term doesn't mean that he doesn't have to govern and lead against a hostile Congress, against the threats of being sued and impeached every other week, Mr. Speaker. We think that when he wants to take unilateral action on things like climate change, when he wants to overcome things like the global financial crisis, when he wants to do something about the minimum wage in that country, that all of those things are better framed through the lens of helping the poor and helping the disadvantaged, regardless of their racial background within that country, rather than adopting a narrative that is exclusionary to some members of that country. On to some substantive speech. The first point is why this would be bad for US politics and practical political outcomes. To understand this point, we need a bit of context. The United States of America has rarely faced the types of multifaceted challenges that it does today, with the hostility within government that it faces today. So when we're looking at a multi-trillion-dollar deficit, when we're looking at trying to get one of the world's largest emitters to do something about climate change to ensure that their economy is modernized and the rest of the world is not punished, when we've had to overcome the legacy of global financial crisis that's required multiple bailouts against the narrative of fiscal conservative in that country, when we've had to grapple with a transitioning economy, those are challenges that affect everybody within that nation. They're challenges that are incredibly important to individual experiences and the way in which politics can alleviate the suffering those experiences can place upon people. They also have an incredibly hostile Congress with a belligerent Tea Party movement that is activist about his race. They also have a hostile media that's been desperately trying to leverage against this president a narrative about his personal experience that positions him as an outsider within that political structure, that says that he might be Muslim, that says that he might not have even been born in that country. When the president themselves makes race an issue, it legitimizes that narrative and entrenches that narrative and positions that debate within that lens. We think Barack Obama has achieved a lot as president. He's made healthcare reform. He's had a bailout package. He's done education reform. He's taken unilateral action on climate change, and he's fundamentally shifted the way in which America engages in foreign policy. All of those things are things that affect poor people and disadvantaged people, of which black people are a disproportionate group. But the only way in which he's been able to do that is by positioning it through that lens of disadvantage and not through race. Three things that this team's world would have made that. Three ways in which this team's world would have made that harder. Number one, would have decreased willingness and cooperation from individual members of Congress. Number one, because it would have been a red flag to the members of that Congress that are racist. Madam Speaker, and we think that they do exist in Congress who have constituencies that care about their self-interest, can only cooperate with a political actor that is seen to be representing their interests as well. But thirdly, because it's an easier narrative for a hostile Congress to block legislation when it's packaged to a dominant narrative that is suspicious to a group and constituency throughout that country. Secondly, it would mean that there's less political will from the public, because we think the presidency is a symbol of national unity. From the perspective that the president, the racial narrative that these guys would have emphasized, would have said that this is a president that represents others more than it represents you, whose experience speaks to a particular constituent's experience rather than the experience of being an American. We think that, from a campaigning perspective, it also hurts the president because he has the support of black people overwhelmingly. So in order to get elected and avoid some of the most conservative politicians taking power in that country, he had to target his rhetoric and his language, the way in which he framed today, towards Middle America in order to get elected. We think that if these guys care about racial politics, those elections and re-elections are incredibly important. Finally, it legitimizes the way in which the media has framed him as an outsider, which means that they would underreport on the minor successes that the president has achieved, underreport on the structural reforms that he's made for all, and make racial narrative the dominant narrative throughout that country. Secondly, why is this bad for racial politics and discourse? It is interesting in this debate that the NAACP has been more critical of what Obama has said on racial issues than what he hasn't said. Because when he went into a school in Chicago and gave a speech that said that being black is not a barrier to success in that country, he was misrepresenting the experience of children within that school who feel that the color of their skin is a barrier to their success. When he individualizes the narrative of being president, his own personal history, above and beyond the racial experiences of other people who are black but have different experiences, he isolates and makes that success and those achievements and that policy relative to one particular experience of being black, but not others within that country. We think that's harmful. We secondly say that it excludes people within that framework. So when the New York Daily News ran an article saying what Obama isn't, black like me, there was the voice of frustration within that narrative from journalists and from particular political activists who are talking about racial issues and don't feel that Barack Obama is equipped to do that. But finally, we say that it radicalizes campaign rhetoric because there is a legacy of guilt in white America that justifiably exists. The question in this debate is whether we want to confront that legacy of guilt in a way that entrenches those people against a position, a political body that needs to do things both now and into the future to alleviate suffering for all people. Mr. Speaker, we think that Barack Obama is a black man. We think that Barack Obama has done things for black people. We think that the reason that he's been able to do so many things within the particularly complex political situation of America is because he's been successful as defining that narrative as one that affects all Americans. We're proud that he's done that.
I think Ed, for speech to continue the case for Vic Wellington, I call on the second speaker, Jody.
Mr. Speaker, on the day that Barack Obama was elected in New Zealand, newspapers read, "Where were you? Where were you on the day that history changed?" Well, we were nowhere, because history didn't change that day. The promise that Barack Obama had made to people, the promise that he had made of hope, of change, of a society that would finally recognise the way in which black people live within that society, was one that fundamentally was given up the very day that he became president. Because we're not going to see another black president, probably, in the very next couple of terms. We're not going to see someone who is ever going to have the same position that Barack Obama was in to make that kind of change. I've got 3 things that I want to look at today. In my in this case. Secondly, we want to look at what he could have achieved versus what they tried to claim he would have to have given up. And thirdly, I want to look at this idea of colourblindness and why exactly we think that that wasn't the best policy for him to take. First thing, in terms of why we think Barack Obama has a particular duty. We told you about his own experience of racism. That is something that he should have spoken to and has a duty because of the way he's experienced it. They were basically just like, he was a well-off black person, right? He didn't experience the same amount of racism that other people experienced, right? But that's just simply, like, yes, maybe it would be better if he'd been, like, more racially discriminated against. But we think that he was racially discriminated against. It's the kinds of policies that mean that police officers stop rich black men who are walking down Wall Street and make them lie on the ground in their suits while other business people are walking past, because that is part of stop and search. It is simply a lie to say that, like, rich black people don't experience the kind of discrimination that means that people cross the street to get away from you. Moreover, we say that we think he has personal experiences of belonging to the black community, of belonging to a black church, and we think that even if he can't speak about the very worst system of racism, he's got a better chance at speaking about it than anybody else. The final thing to say is, they never told you who exactly is supposed to speak about this racism, right? Because we think the people that have those very bad experiences are never going to be in the position that Barack Obama is, so we think we get better discussion rather than no discussion. The final thing to say is they just wanted to deny the idea that he exploited his blackness in his campaign, right? That was the reason that he was able to distinguish himself from Hillary, right? He was able to say, I represent a minority too. He was able to use that narrative about oppression of black people and about oppression of disadvantaged minorities in general to say that society was something that needed to be changed. We think he did exploit that. The end result of that, we think, is a duty on him to talk about his own personal experiences and a duty on him to actually realize that race matters. Second point, in terms about what he could have achieved. Because they wanted to talk to you about how there were all these great issues that he has to deal with and what they thought this was going to undermine. The first thing they said was that, well, we need a president with a unifying narrative, right? The thing to recognize here is that a president is is the face of a political party, right? He's not simply representative of every single person in America when he speaks on policy issues. He does take a particular stance, and we think that particular stance is sometimes disadvantageous to some people over other people, right? When he takes a stance on climate change, he's taking a stance that is either pro-green or anti-business or whatever. We think that doesn't undermine his ability to be unifying. We think it just actually entrenches the idea that he can change the political values that exist. The second thing to say is that we don't think it undermines the support with moderates, right? We've seen that, in fact, his support from those kinds of people has gone down since he was elected in 2008 and used race as an issue to when they thought that he was no longer engaging in the kind of issues that they wanted to see him engaging in. We think that moderates never cared about that in the first place, right? That's why he was able to get that much of a groundswell of support. The final thing that they said was laughable, right? They were like, cooperation. He needs to be able to get cooperation. He's in a deadlock, Mr. Speaker. We don't think he had that much cooperation in the first place. And we think the way that he managed to pass Obamacare showed that he never really had that political capital in the first place. Finally, in substantive addition to this, why exactly we think that the political narrative of race is something that's very difficult for these kinds of people to combat. And that's for a number of reasons. The first thing to say here is that we think Obama had a plethora of issues in terms of race that he could choose from, right? He could choose crime, he could choose economic disadvantage, schooling, all of those things, right? It gives him the perfect platform to choose something that's relatively friendly in terms of racial policy. The next thing to say is that we don't think that conservatives are very good at dealing with race for two reasons, right? The first one is that the Tea Party's big focus is on things like big government and is on things like freedom in order for the people to decide for themselves, right? Race is not particularly a framework that fits particularly well within that narrative of big government and freedom. We think this was why they were particularly very good at dealing with issues like Obamacare, but they probably wouldn't be very good at dealing with race. The second thing to say then is that we think that the Republican Party and the Tea Party are not particularly good at their messaging at the moment, right? And race is something that you need to have a particularly nuanced message about, or else you just come across sounding like a dickhead. We think that exactly shows that examples of this is like the fact that Boehner can't control his Tea Party congressman, right? And we think that's exactly when you're going to expose the extremes of racism that exist with people like Bundy, recognizing that those kinds of things are really, really bad, and we think that will make it something that's easy for Obama to recognize and to get about. What do we have then? We have then on our side of the house, we think we create a mainstream issue that is identified in people's minds as being important. We think we create a liberal activist base that is very able to deal with this issue going forward into elections. And we think we mobilize people to vote in things like these state elections, where these kinds of issues of race are often dealt with in terms of state politics. We think that is a really good thing. Just because that doesn't deal with the issues of every single person in the country is not a reason to say that we should ignore it. And that's the final point that I want to get onto now. This idea about colorblindness, right? Because saying that there is not a black America and there is not a white America, but there is just simply one America, actually entrenches the very oppressive narratives that we think operate within American politics today, right? It entrenches the idea that the way to deal with disadvantage of black people is just simply to deal with the disadvantage of all people, right? Where we think that dealing with the disadvantage of all people doesn't recognize the structural issues that exist within society that mean that even if we do raise all votes, black people's votes are still going to be at the very, very bottom, and we think that is something that is problematic. When Obama says, look at me, look, I was able to get up there and, you know, exploit all of that. When he's able to get up there and say, look, you know, being black wasn't something that led to me, you know, not being able to be president. We think that reinforces the idea of colorblindness. Obviously, we would find it better if Obama was blacker, or, you know, he was more disadvantaged, or all of those things that he wanted to criticize him for. But we think that he is the only person that is in that unique position of being able to speak to that. And we think that when he ignores that kind of crazy stuff that say he's a Muslim, he just allows that to be entrenched within the public space, very proud to say he let black people down, he let America down, he let us all down.
Thank you for a speech. Now to continue attendance for USU. I call on the second speaker, Abby.
Ladies and gentlemen, when Barack Obama was able to introduce greater health care for all Americans, that policy advantaged black people more than it advantaged white people. When he was able to raise education levels in America, that policy advantaged black people more than it advantaged white people. And our point on our side of the house isn't that Barack Obama should be able to do things like fix the huge problems that exist in a racial context in America, but that his capacity to pass the policies that have benefited black people would be fundamentally compromised if they were framed through a background of race that was based on his experience as one individual, as opposed to that of the American nation and of thematic ideas of general equality and general advance. We stood on that very clearly on our side of the house. They didn't engage. What have we talked about today? Firstly, does Barack Obama have a moral obligation because of his position to take this particular racial stance? And secondly, and quite clearly, what effect does this have on politics in terms of the rallying of liberals, the framing of racial issues, etc.? I'm going to go through that and then add extra material at the end of this debate about the precedent this sets for other campaigns of racial targeting, racial questions that are able to be given once the president makes this very strong statement that race must be relevant, that race must be the grounds on which we speak about future policy. So firstly, moral obligations. The opposition had three contentions. Firstly, that Obama experienced oppression and is best positioned to speak about that oppression, therefore he should. Secondly, that we could use this story to get ahead in politics specifically in the runoff that second speaker wanted to talk about. And thirdly, that the president has the most powerful role in narrative creation, which is why he should focus on the narrative of disadvantage that he'd experienced. Firstly, the idea that Obama was oppressed. On our side of the house, we never were creating the farcical example the opposition wanted to give, that we just wanted him to be a bit more oppressed and then we would have let him take that on. That was dumb, obviously. What we said on our side of the house is that Obama has experienced some forms of oppression, but not all of those that identify or create a holistic narrative of what black oppression can and does encompass. So, interestingly, if you read that article that we referred to about what Obama isn't, black like me, it referred to the fact that most black Africans do have a heritage of slavery that Obama doesn't have, do have an experience of being excluded from educational institutions that Obama doesn't have. And that wasn't a problem with a lack of experience for him, but a problem with the role of the president defining what black meant in a social sense during his presidency that necessarily precluded those other experiences of being black. The opposition needed to say that Obama wasn't just a representative of black culture, but the single greatest one because of his experience of that. We thought that was farcical. Secondly, could he use that story to get ahead? Ladies and gentlemen, the opposition wanted to say the great thing about Obama was that he could use that history of being black to move past Hillary Clinton and put it on the agenda. Except the premise of this debate is that he did not, ladies and gentlemen. Obama didn't use it. He used his fresh ideas in the American public. The fact that he was young and vibrant in comparison with previous ones. You know, his history at Harvard. Those were the kinds of things he did use to get ahead. And as we said at first speaker, he didn't need to point out he was black for people to be aware of that already and to support him on those grounds. Instead, making that the currency of conversation would have harmed that race. It would have invited the kinds of racist conversation the opposition didn't want to recognize existing reality in America. It would have made that worse. But thirdly, the idea of narrative creation. This is where the opposition's characterization of this debate is really important, because they both wanted to say that as the president, you have the single greatest capacity to define the experience of the nation or the goals of the nation or backgrounds that people have and the causal links or lives they lead afterwards. On our side of the House, we accept that premise that the president has that fundamental power, which is why on our side of the House we would never have that individual define that experience in a way that was necessarily exclusive on racial terms. Who would define that their particular narrative, that their goal forward was one that could only apply to black people as opposed to all people. Could not apply to all the thematic things that are experienced by black people, but also by other African individuals or other minorities, South Americans, Mexicans, all those people who experience it as well. When that individual had so much power in that narrative, we wanted to make sure it was stretched out to everyone and not based on skin color. But where did this debate really lie? Because after the moral obligation, it was like we've kind of taken a utilitarian perspective, and the moral obligation goes aside if you couldn't do anything about it. Like the purpose of speaking out is to be able to create change. They had four contentions. Firstly, that moderate support goes down when Obama doesn't correctly identify himself to the public or use that framework to identify himself. Secondly, that the Tea Party is based on ideological perceptions and can't really engage on racial ones. And then thirdly, the stuff about creating a liberal activist base. Thank God that paper is there. So firstly, the idea that moderate support would go down. On our side of the House, we would say that moderate support absolutely already existed for Obama, and the liberal activism the opposition wanted to talk about was exactly what existed at the campaign. Obama had the highest rate of small individual donations. He had huge voter turnout. He had youth volunteering everywhere. And all of that was done on the basis that the narrative of success of America's future wasn't exclusive, wasn't based on his experience as a racial individual. Like the opposition wanted to get up here and say that in politics, Obama came and was, gave this promise of a racial narrative and a racial future. That was bull. Obama came to the forefront of America trying to recover from the GFC, trying to, fix problems with healthcare and with insecurity that were in no way framed in racial terms. They were the promises he made. They were the ones that we thought would politically suffer. Secondly, they wanted to say the Tea Party is won't be able to engage because it's racist or race versus ideology. They wanted to say you look like a bit of a dick when you say rude things about people based on race. We totally agree. We think it's really unfortunate that the Tea Party has never shown a great concern about looking like dicks in the American political system, and instead, the opposition raising racial issues invites the racists who we know exist in America, 22% of whom still believe Obama is an Arab because he has a middle name of Hussein. Those individuals are invited to participate in that conversation. It becomes a legitimate question of race. How do you feel about Obama's race? Oh, you're uncomfortable? Let's talk it out. Maybe you have a legitimate concern. By sidelining that conversation, Obama didn't say that you couldn't consider him in a racial way, but that he didn't want to, and that he was empowered to look at himself as a man outside of the color of his skin. We were very, very proud to not give the Tea Party that currency that we talked about that would exist in the media and was never addressed, that thematic framing that would occur. But lastly, ladies and gentlemen, we think that in terms of the disadvantage of black people being distinct to others and future campaigns that Jodie wanted to talk about, Barack Obama setting this as a precedent for future campaigns is fundamentally dangerous. Because we agreed that you can choose the woman you marry or the university you go to, how many kids you have. Those elements of personal background are ones that individuals can opt into the campaign. But you should not have a president who says, my racial background was relevant. I want you to ask me questions from that position, because that framing is then applied to every other candidate of a racial minority in every other campaign afterwards. Once Barack Obama has identified himself as a black man who sees things from a black perspective, that's applied to every other black candidate in every other race that we see in America. It's applied to Puerto Ricans or to individuals who want to see themselves out of that kind of status that the president has said you should be defined by. If we take the opposition's conception, ladies and gentlemen, that the president creates narratives about what you should link in terms of their outcomes or their goals with their experience, you should never,
ever say that it is one based on race as opposed to one based on individual experience or thematic ideological goals. We were very, very proud to
I think Andy for a speech now to conclude the case of Wellington. I can want the third speaker next.
What the second negative speaker just conceded is that race has been a defining issue of Barack Obama's presidency, but only for his opponents. He has never been able to own that experience and own the fact that his people have been oppressed in America, right? And it's not enough to say that just because his great-great-grandfather wasn't a slave doesn't mean he can't represent those people, right? Because no one individual can ever be representative of the entire black experience. But it is about the fact that he has faced racism almost every single day in his life, just like almost every black person in America. And that's why he has a duty, Mr. Speaker, because he talked about this, he needed to own it. 3 questions in this debate. What is the role of the president? What is the role of Barack Obama? Secondly, let's talk about political narratives, their material. Thirdly, let's talk about benefits. What sort of racism is Barack Obama familiar with in his role as a black American? Let's go through some examples. One, it is well known that when Barack Obama was young, he was part of what was known as the Choom Gang, a marijuana smoking gang. Even though he was lucky himself enough not to be arrested for his marijuana smoking, he would have known that as a black American, he faced massively higher likelihood of being prosecuted for those crimes. He would have known people who would have been prosecuted for those crimes, Mr. Speaker. Let's talk about the fact that he was part of a black liberation church, right? Halfway through his primary campaign, he was forced to defend the fact that Reverend Wright had been talking about radical black liberationist theology within that church. What did he say during the election campaign? He said, I can no more disown Reverend Wright than I can disown my white grandmother, Mr. Speaker. He made race a part of what he stood for as a candidate, but not as a president. And we think that is outrageous, right? And we don't think they've been able to show that just because he isn't the poorest black person in the world doesn't mean he can never talk about it. Because that's what people saw him in. That's what everyone knew he meant when he said that change had come to America, Mr. Speaker. Let's talk secondly about what the president should do. Because they said that the president should represent everyone's experiences. But that relied on a form of national unity that was fundamentally a lie. Because the experience of being an American, what it means to wear the red, white, and blue, is different if you are a black American, Mr. Speaker. They never challenged that. They just said that the president needs to lie. But what we see furthermore is that the role of the president is as a politician, and politicians should deliver on their promises. He talked about race during his campaign. That's when he was most popular, and he didn't deliver on that promise when he became president. And just because other things were happening doesn't mean he can't also talk about race, right? Yeah, sure, the global financial crisis happened, and he did stuff. We're not saying that he should have got up every day out of bed and delivered a speech about race. He can do other things too, right? But that was ridiculous. But finally, what we said is that he was defining the experience of being a black American by omission. And this is the material they never responded to. Because by allowing himself to be beige, to be discoloured, he was allowing the narrative to be promoted that, being a black American no longer matters, right? He was harming all black Americans by omission. And that is the biggest outrage in this debate that they have never responded to. So absolutely, there was a duty because of that experience and because of his role, right? And the implication of their material is just that, like, a Democrat who is elected by a majority can never represent minorities, right? Our democratic institutions absolutely need to be aspirational in terms of the way we help those who are most in need. Right. Secondly, let's talk about the political aspects of this debate, because they never really got around to responding to Jodie's material, right? Because we agree, Barack Obama has faced significant political capital issues. But let's look at where those political capital issues have actually arisen, right? They haven't arisen when he's talked about race. They've arisen when he's talked about healthcare and when he's passed all the other things he wanted to talk about, right? That's because, like, the Tea Party was able to rally all of their opponents behind the healthcare bill, right? Not a single Republican congressman voted for the healthcare bill, notwithstanding the lack of Barack Obama talking about race, right? So it's not clear how he has built more political capital by not talking about race. But we say he has actually massively harmed his political capital. And this is, I don't think, the sort of stuff they've ever responded to by not talking about race. Because let's look at how Republicans talk about race. You're right. They talk about birthright. They talk about the fact that he might be an Arab, right? That's how Democrats lose elections. Sorry, Democrats win elections these days. They get their opponents to say stupid shit, right? Look at Richard Murdoch, who was 10 points ahead in the Indiana Senate primary, but then said that said something stupid about abortion, right? We think that actually the problem with the Tea Party is that they have been able to successfully align Americans around narratives about big government. That's because they've been able to own the conversation about big government, right? They have never been able to own the conversation about race. But that's a discussion, that's a situation where Obama wouldn't be burning political capital, he would be building political capital, right? Because we think that absolutely Barack Obama, they don't think they've been able to show that this is going to make Congress more hostile, this is going to lose him votes, because that's how he won votes. Let's talk about his legislative program. Because actually what we said was how Barack Obama should define race wasn't like putting more bills through Congress and wasting legislative time. It's that he needs to address the big issue, right? It's that when Florida is passing voter ID laws, which are like a thinly veiled way to discriminate against black voters, he needs to talk about that and say that that's what it is, rather than just allowing this bullshit about how we need more security in our vote system, right? We don't think that was an issue. It's the fact that he never addressed the Trayvon Martin case specifically in the discussion about race. And that is a primary example of where if you're a black American, you are more likely to be seen as a criminal if you are just innocently walking down the street, right? But we never got the leadership there, and that leadership has been missing. So he can be a leader in multiple senses. In the legislative sense, he can pass that sort of legislation, and in a social sense, he can actually advocate that. So let's talk about the benefits, right? And the first benefit we said was in terms of the role of the president to be able to define national identity, right? And let's not pretend national identity isn't being defined in other ways in the absence of Barack Obama's discussion about legislation, right? Because the Tea Party, because they said liberal activism happened already, but it simply has not happened to the extent of what the Tea Party has been able to do, right? Because they've been able to rally around their leaders. And when the liberals look to their activism and they look to their political leaders, they essentially see a void, right? And that's because they expected Barack Obama to be that sort of leader. That's why they made all those micro donations rather than Barack Obama having to rely on big donations to get that. But it's been absent, right? And that's why you haven't seen a liberal activist movement which has been to the sort of on the size and scale of the Tea Party, right? Let's talk about the importance of that sort of activist movement, right? Because what we said is that activist movements are on the small scale able to change the way people view and people think. And we think that when you did get more discussion about the role of race in America, it would become obvious, right? Because race is something that's invisible to you unless you've experienced it through those eyes. The fact that people will cross the street to avoid you because they think you're likely to be a criminal, for instance, right? And we think if you got that sort of discussion, people would be voting more on those issues, right? This isn't something which the fact that most white people are racist. We agree that if people's eyes were open, they wouldn't be. It's the fact that people don't see the issues because no one's talking about it. Finally, we said that let's talk about redefining national values, because what the Tea Party has really been successful in is actually saying America is about liberty and freedom and capitalism, etc., 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 and essentially smashing the idea of big government. And it's Barack Obama's reliance on trying to combat that narrative that's meant he's lost a lot of support, and it's meant he's lost a lot of political capital and solidified the Tea Party behind it, right? But we say that there is an opportunity because capitalism is not the only American value. In the 60s, leaders like Martin Luther King showed us that America can be about raising the experiences of people who are lowest in the heap, right? Barack Obama never did that. Where is the man that we saw in 2008? We miss him sorely.
Screen still.
I think with respect now to conclude page Sydney, I want to perfect English.
What matters most to most of the people in the prisons that they were talking about, or the poor streets that they were worried about, were state services. Basic healthcare, basic education. And when you frame those issues around being black issues, and not issues of injustice, which everyone can get behind, you lose political capital, both from within Congress and outside Congress. The most important thing in this debate was providing those services. That's why this debate falls very clearly to side negative. I'll talk about those policy aims first. First thing we told you was that you lose support from within Congress because it acts as a red flag for any racist, because immediately they see that issue as something that is race-based and not something they have to consider. That means you lose support instantly like that. They told us, well, there's a deadlock at the moment, which didn't engage with all the examples that we gave you. We agree with the third affirmative that healthcare took a lot of bloody political capital to get through, and it should have been spent there, and not promoting healthcare as something that was a black issue, and instead something for all Americans. The biggest contention they had around this idea of Congress was that you should have a rallying point on the left that supports this side of politics against the Tea Party. What was important in this issue is they never told us why it had to be a rallying point around race and not one around injustice. If we look at my own country, for instance, the amount of rallying around Tony Abbott's unjust policies has frightened me beyond anything that I could possibly imagine. Not frightened, excited, I guess. But the fact was that more people are willing to get around that rallying cause of there is something seriously wrong here, injustice and there is poverty, rather than isolating that issue to one race. Particularly when you say to that race that I understand exactly how you feel, when you might not, when Obama doesn't necessarily have that support. So we said it cuts out a massive part of that rallying cause. We also told you that for that rallying cause around race to be successful, it had to be a good one. And I'll get on to why that isn't true. But it was also empirically false, because Obama had the largest grassroots support that we've ever seen for any president, and that was something that was equally effective at combating the Tea Party. The Tea Party wanted small government, and they were effective at propagating that view. That was the contention of this House. We say the way to combat that is to propagate big government by appealing to injustice and appealing to everyone, not just one group of Americans. The second reason the policy aims were threatened was because you lose people. Because instead of having everyone on board, instead of framing all issues as American issues, you framed them as black issues. And it wasn't true that Obama never talked about race. It was just that he didn't base his policies around a race-based approach. It was to say that he could talk about black injustice without saying that the reason I'm implementing these policies is because of my experience as a black man, or my thought that black people need it the most. We told you that it isolates people from your agenda because it says that your policy is for one issue. Jody said, well, yeah, but you isolate people all the time, like you isolate people on environmental policy. Exactly. But the way that you sell environmental policy is you say that this is what's best for everyone. This is what's best for America. And people are likely to listen to your message much more if you say that instead of on racial grounds. Finally, we told you the media makes this worse because they look for a thematic consistency with which to report. And what it says is it legitimizes the attacks on his race if he makes race the issue. Nick said, well, it's good to identify the racists and have them come out and call dickheads. But it's worse because those voices do exist. 22% of people in America thought that he wasn't born in America. And to legitimize those views in the media and to give them power is a bad thing. At the end of that issue, what became clear was Obama, it's very hard to regret a president that has been able to do so much for people all around America. Not just black people, but generally people who are disadvantaged, many of whom are black. What they had to show was that he would have been as able to pass those policies if he had framed those issues under a racial ground, and they weren't able to do that. That meant black people were worse off. Let's talk then about racial narratives. We think that black people and the identity of being black in America is not something that's singular, and what this does is harm that. Firstly, because his own narrative of being black is not a good one. Because we told you that he may have been discriminated against, but not to the extent that these guys introduced in Ash's speech. He'd never been to prison. He'd never experienced any of the things that he himself said black people were facing. And what that said is attached that experience with Obama's experience. Yes, he smoked a fuckload of weed, but he did it with his Harvard buddies in his dorm room, not the way that many other people in the US would do that. Maybe, me. Maybe he doesn't. Shit, that's on camera. Maybe he doesn't talk about racial issues because he doesn't feel comfortable doing it because he knows he hasn't experienced the same thing. That's why when he went to a school, he said, pull yourselves up by your bootstraps and succeed. He didn't acknowledge the structural problem that these guys wanted to acknowledge. He was one of the worst actors for that to occur because his story was fundamentally different. And the problem with that was he defined it. He defined the experience in a singular way, and these guys admitted that when they wanted him to use that positively. He said, this is what being black is. What that meant, and the second problem, was that it excluded others and defined black identity for everyone else. It says that his success was based on being black. We shouldn't celebrate him being president and say that he was president because he was black. We should celebrate the fact that he is a black president, and this did the opposite. The second thing was it said that it took away any other ideas or narratives about being black. It said that you know, my experience of being black is what generally being black is like, and it made it hard for other black people within black communities around the US to challenge his policy aims, to say, no, actually, that's not what the problem is. The problem isn't, you know, weed smoking in Harvard dorm rooms. It's massive drug abuse on the streets of the Bronx. It made it hard for people to do that. But here's the most pernicious harm. If you invite people to look into your racial background and just because you're justifying your policies that way, if you haven't been disadvantaged to the degree that other black people have, it says that it is okay, that those problems don't exist. If Obama hasn't experienced that discrimination, and that's how he bases his policies, then it says to other people, then that is the experience or discrimination that other black people face. That if this is how he defines his discrimination and disadvantage, that is how all black people experience disadvantage. We told you that instead, those voices should come from other people. And they do. They come from church leaders. They come from community groups. They come from spokespeople that actually know what it is to be the most disadvantaged black men or women in society. And it shouldn't come from one figure that is meant to unify an American identity and instead unifies a black identity based on something that is a lie. Finally, we told you that well, they said not speaking on racial issues implies that race is no longer an issue, and therefore we've gotten over it. We told you, first of all, that other actors are able to fill in that discussion. Second, is that that's just like, I'm struggling to read what I wrote. Is that they had to prove that their racial narrative was a better one. And thirdly, we told you that some of the experiences that he had, as I talked about before, weren't ones that everyone shared. Finally, they said, well, you know, it was because he used race in his election that created a moral duty. First of all, we told you that the moral duty was to be most advantageous to the people that he apparently represented, and the way to do that was different. It was perhaps pragmatic that he did, but Abby said he didn't, and that was the premise of this debate. At the end of this speech, what becomes clear is what matters most to black people is the provision of services and the ability of Obama to actually provide for them, as he promised. And he's been able to do that because he's been able to unite America around a narrative of injustice and disadvantage, not one of race-based discrimination and isolating people, and that would lead to a much worse outcome.
I thank Ingrid for his speech, now to deliver the negative reply on A.
Mr. Speaker, the man the American people elected in 2008 was a black man. He wasn't a man who promised to lead as a black man and for black people. His experience in that particular racial background, that particular disadvantage, whatever that may be, defining narrative of that president. What he promised was to lead, to achieve results for the American people against the most hostile Congress that leadership has ever seen, in a context where those challenges are greater than that country has ever faced. We think he's done a very good job at that. That would have been set back if he'd embraced more the narrative of his personal experiences as an African American. One big question at the end of the debate, which is, what would a more significant racial narrative have actually achieved the US presidency over the last 6 years? Because these guys set up the imperative in this debate as two things. Firstly, that 50% of the prison population are black, and that there are racist laws in place disadvantaging black people. But secondly, that people the racial discourse in America is currently one-sided and dominated by conservatives. So let's look at how well they did on those two levels and whether those things were harmed or benefited. On a political level, we told you that this jeopardized the cooperation of others that were already reluctant to give it. Racist members of parliament who would have their narratives legitimated. Political strategists who wanted to marginalize that president, and that president now marginalizing himself. Hostility towards that president from a conservative public and a conservative media, which would now have access to a simplified and packaged narrative that put him as an outsider within that discourse. These guys came up firstly and told us that there are always trade-offs and that there are always policies towards the disadvantage of others, and that the policy challenges that he faced were on climate change and other things. We said yes. And to the extent that Barack Obama had been a president that had to disadvantage a number of people over the course of his presidency, it was very important that he did so through a framework that was accessible to the greatest number of people, and that was legitimate in the eyes of the greatest number of people. This was a narrative, and this was a narrative instead, that would say to those who were disadvantaged by his policies that they were disadvantaged because this president had a particular connection to a particular group of people that rendered his judgment poor. The second thing they told us is that we can overcome those things through an increase in liberal activism, through a rallying point that this president could have provided. We said, what? This is a president that got over $1 billion in grassroots donations, that had the biggest campaign infrastructure of any president. He's had access to all the liberal activists in the world, Mr. Speaker. His racial narrative was likely to be an exclusionary one, not one that would have rallied more to that cause. What it would have done is aggravate the other side, aggravate the people that wanted to put him in that position of being a president for only one specific contingency and not for the United States of America. The consequence of that from a political level is important, because when he passed healthcare reform, more black people than white got coverage. When he raised school funding, more black kids than white kids were benefited by that. So even though there may be more progress for African Americans to be achieved, this side jeopardized the very real progress that he has been able to achieve for the sake of an idealistic aim. Secondly, they told us that they wanted a two-sided, they told us that the current racial discourse was two-sided. We had two big contentions. Number one, that Barack Obama was incapable of representing the other side, because the discrimination experience that he had was one distinct experience of discrimination and not representative of all. That in this particular instance, it was an unhelpful experience for the types of things that they wanted to say. Because when he had been caught smoking marijuana, he was in a Harvard dorm room, and his takeaway experience from that was that you can get away with it. And that had been reflected in the narrative of what he'd said in speeches to kids in schools about how they as individuals could pull themselves up by their bootstraps, that it wasn't a problem for government. But we also told you that there were other voices in that participation, better voices. They were crowded out when the single most powerful cultural leader in that land dominated that narrative, dominated that discussion in a way that radicalized other people and set back the real political achievement of what's happened in the last 6 years. Mr. Speaker, we think Barack Obama's been a very good president. He's been a very tough president. He's had to deal with very tough circumstances. He would have done a worse job if he'd made racial narratives a more significant part of his presidency.
I think as we've replied, that concludes the case of the convention and the debate. I call on
Next time you're at a public meeting and you feel the need to destabilize a minority person talking about their experiences, take a leaf out of Sydney's book. First of all, what you do is put up your hand and say, excuse me, I don't think that you're black enough to talk about what black people experience. And if that doesn't work, what you should do after that is put your hand up and say, why are you talking about white people as well? Because we are people too. The last thing you say is, this is a little bit divisive. I think you should be more unifying. This is divisive. It's more divisive even than black people being murdered by police on the street, talking about the experiences of an oppressed minority. We promised you on this side of the House that we could create change if he'd lifted a finger to talk about his own experiences and didn't have political advisors who ran the same kind of lines and ideas as they did on this side of the House. He would have galvanized people to build a base. What was the response on this side of the House? Well, at Ed, we had this idea that he was like rich already and he was the most powerful organizer ever. Why then does he not control Congress as well as the White House? Loan donations are not enough. He failed to take that opportunity. You need to galvanize people on these kind of policies. What Nick told you is when there's an argument about voter identification laws, you need somebody who says not oh, there's actually not that much fraud anyway, we don't need these racist laws. You need somebody to say, these laws are about race. Otherwise, that goes entirely unnoticed and the opportunity is missed. We told you that his speeches and talking about this would bring the idea into a public discourse in the way that it wouldn't, in the way that it wouldn't if you just talked about unification and pretended as though nobody were white or black anymore. What was the response? Abby, it would make race a legitimate question. Well, shit, yes, it would. Right? For whom she was concerned about making race like a legitimate discussion, already think it's legitimate to criticize him for his race. They are never going to vote for him anyway. They are never going to vote for anti-racist policies. This was the whole point that ran through our case from the beginning. His positioning has left himself in a place where he is an icon for people who are racist, but refuses to be one for people who need him to be an anti-racist figurehead and icon. What was their further complaint? Oh, there was a New York Post article that Ed has read where somebody criticized Obama for not being radical enough in his race. Like, good God, that we would have contested decision about the experience of like oppression in America, right? That's the kind of discourse that only happened because at one point in time he identified himself as being black so people could respond to the idea of him being black in a critical conversational way. That's what we get on this side of the house. That's what they want to shut down. What were their other concerns? This was Anged's Hail Mary, right? He was like, basic services are what black people in America care about most, and I will deliver them to the prisons so long as we pretend that race is no longer an issue. We'd lose out on other policy options, is what we were told, right? We told you that healthcare and all of these things are in different spaces. And we weren't asking him on this side of the house to be like, this is my healthcare reform policy and it's for black people. That's what healthcare is about. We weren't asking him to say climate change is all about black people. It's possible for somebody to have a legislative agenda and at the same time go to certain places to talk about race and his own experiences. These operate in different spaces. No cooperation, they said. Well, how can it get any worse? Congress hates him. He has a minority position in that place. He has since 2010. They weren't able to point to any legislative changes more recently than healthcare that would be jeopardized by the fact that he would get people who already dislike him off side. Finally, the idea that this was like not as powerful as a narrative of poverty. Like, how difficult is it being in the United States to talk about ideas of inequality or have anybody take you seriously when you talk about like structural economic disadvantage? This is a country that rapidly believes in capitalism and inequality is like a good in and of itself. Notions of equality and the idea that maybe they are not as racially blind as they like to pretend are things which can have traction in that country in a way that poverty quite simply cannot. He had a chance, right? And I wanted to tell you that there were other people to talk about this. Who was that going to be? By their own very criticisms of him as not being black enough, it's going to be very difficult to find anybody who can occupy a position of power who's black enough by their standards to ever speak about it. We weren't asking him to get up every morning and talk about it. We weren't asking him to be more black than he actually is. We were asking him to show up the table in the way that he led us to believe he would.
I thank both teams for what was an excellent debate. Results will be released back in Marama Hall where we met this morning, just before the ESL Grand Final.